Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's BioConference webinar. I'm Bob Woodard, and I'll be moderator for today's event. Before we start, I have a few announcements to make. This webcast is designed to be interactive. We encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them into the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems while viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation window, or submit your problem through the green Q&A button on the lower left. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. John Bradfield. Dr. Bradfield is the Senior Director of the Association for the Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care. He is a veterinarian and a diplomate of the American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine. Dr. Bradfield also has a PhD in experimental pathology with scholarly publications in various areas of laboratory animal medicine, wound healing, and vascular and platelet biology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradfield. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on training and competency in research animal programs. As Bob said, I'm John Bradfield, coming to you from our offices in Frederick, Maryland, at the ALAC office. Got three basic segments to today's presentation regarding training in animal care programs. First, just a few brief introductory remarks on requirements. Of course, that's going to vary a lot depending on where you are in the world, so it's much too detailed of a topic to cover in a lot of depth. But we'll cover the highlights for a couple of major geographical areas. Then I'll move into some ALAC trend data, which I think illustrates where programs tend to have difficulties and challenges associated with training and competency. And then the last part of the program will involve assessments, strategies for how you assess the effectiveness of training programs and ways to go about that. So I hope you find it helpful. And with that, let's get started. So this next slide sort of illustrates from the guide, from the care and use point of view, the ILAR guide, if you will, those various groups of people who need training. So the guide is widely used in the U.S. and in many places around the globe. So I think it's a good place to turn to first to look for some basic guidelines about the kinds of people in the animal program that need training. There's a lot of sections in this newest edition of the guide, the 2011 version. There's two different sections, and the page numbers listed there on screen, 47 separate text references, and 15 pages cited in the index. So this new iteration of the guide has a lot more language about training and who needs it. Specifically, they mentioned four major groups of people in the animal program. IACUC member training, training for the animal care staff, obviously the veterinary staff and their qualifications and training, as well as investigators and their staffs and the training involved for them. So the guide identifies those four key groups of people as needing training in order to be competent in what they do. Of course, in the U.S., there's the animal welfare regulations as well that has something to say about training. That'll come up in a minute. And for ALAC, when we do accreditation site visits, we also use the Ag Guide, the FAS Ag Guide as a reference, as well as ETS 123. And any regulations in the country in which we're doing the site visit also apply. So the guide has this particular statement on page 15 that really is all-encompassing, and it sort of gets to the crux of the matter. And there's a few big words in this passage. All personnel, that's unequivocal as to who they're talking about in the animal care program. So that's all personnel involved with animal care and use must, and the guide uses that word intentionally. That is a mandatory requirement, if you will, to be adequately educated, trained, or qualified. So that's a pretty all-encompassing statement from the guide that really can be quite problematic when you think about terms of training program and how to implement that. I mentioned the animal welfare regulations here in the U.S. Won't go into depth in this, but they're listed here on this screen. Section 2.32, the regulations pinpoint technicians, animal technicians, scientists, plus others, sort of a vague category. Again, you see the must word. Training and instruction of personnel must include various things. And that this must be ongoing at sufficient frequency. So a pretty tall order again in the regulations. Must include humane methods, and they list basic needs of each animal species, handling and care, pre-procedural, post-procedural care, and aseptic surgical techniques. They go on to say that additional training topics include training in the limit in the use of animals and those procedures that minimize pain and distress, anesthetics, analgesics, tranquilizers, and training on how to report deficiencies, interestingly enough, in the regulations. And then finally, point 5 here in the regs, training should be provided to let people know about the services available to provide information on appropriate methods of animal care and use, alternatives to the use of animals, avoiding unnecessary duplication, and about the Animal Welfare Act itself. So a real brief overview of the regulations in the U.S. If we look to Europe, the European Directive has very clear language again about requirements for training. And I like the term that the Directive uses here in Article 23, that personnel should be competent. They shall be adequately educated and trained before they perform any of the following: carrying out procedures on animals, designing projects, taking care of animals, or animal euthanasia. So the directive is quite clear that personnel need to be competent before they engage in any of those activities. At the bottom of this screen, you see a URL that is, I think, a quite valuable guidance document. These are guidelines developed in February this year at a conference at Brussels. That's a very detailed document on how to implement the requirements of the directive for European member states. Whether in Europe or not, I think this is a pretty valuable resource. So if you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to look at this document as you're considering ways to develop or augment your training programs. A little bit more detail on this document. It's entitled A Working Document for the Development of Common Education and Training Framework to Fulfill the Requirements of the Directive. Big name. I'll refer to it as the Brussels document. It's about 100 pages long. It's very detailed and comprehensive. There is a lot of detail in there that is worthwhile. It outlines the structure and component of training programs, and more particular, this idea of competency, which I think is a good one. Training is one thing, competency is another, and these guidelines, as well as the directive itself, really highlights that point. Towards the end of the document, there are suggested training modules in their content. So it's a good place to look at those. There's 22 of them they offer as being worthwhile to consider. Various functions like core and functional tasks to meet the intent of the directive, as well as skill-based tasks for other modules. And again, the URL there is at the bottom of this screen. So if you're not familiar with that document, I'd encourage you to look at it, whether you're in Europe or anywhere else around the globe. So we think about training, and we develop programs because of all these requirements to train personnel to be adept at the procedures they conduct, whether it be animal care or scientific methods. And so we offer training, and we usually consider that good. We offer training, people are required to take it, end of story. Well, this Brussels guidance document gives us an idea that there's a lot more steps to this process when you think about competency. So they suggest for studies that involve the potential for animal pain and distress, that training obviously occurs. That's the first step. But really, one might sort of look at this pass assessment. That's just an assimilation of the training materials. And there are many other steps involved in this chain of competency. Working under supervision, evaluating deeper learning, and then a competency exam or test of some sort to determine that skills are met, and that this is sort of a cyclic stage that occurs ongoing over time to maintain skills and perform competency tests. So it's not just a one-and-done training, so to speak. There are multiple steps. It's ongoing, not a trivial task. Okay, let me shift gears a little bit and talk about some ALAC findings with regard to program assessments that we do around the globe, and how often training comes up as an issue, and whether or not there are any common trends in training deficiencies. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background material here in the next couple of slides about our data set and where it comes from, so you can sort of assess the breadth and scope of these data. So we have around 930 accredited units across the globe in the ALAC family, if you will. These are institutions who use animals, and we do site visits to these 930 institutions at least once every 3 years. That translates to about 100 plus site visits every trimester, 300 site visits a year. So this is a busy activity that ALAC engages in. You may know that if you're part of a ALAC accredited institution, that at the end of a site visit, we offer commentary that we call the exit briefing. These are preliminary findings of the site visit team, and we leave you with a list of things that we think your program does particularly well and strengths, as well as any issues of concern that we have. So this data set I'll describe here in a minute is all the comments left at the institutions at the exit briefing. If we look at how these accredited institutions are dispersed around the globe, this map sort of gives you an idea of where the accredited institutions are. We began years ago, exactly 50 years ago, in North America, so a good number of our institutions are in North America, with Europe and the Pacific Rim making the bulk of the international community. But South America, Latin America, and other places around the globe are also involved in that. So 300 site visits a year around the globe. You're getting a pretty fair representative of a lot of different institutions in the findings that you're about to see. One last bit of demographics here before we get to the findings. If we look at the accredited community as a whole, you see that the big sector there is the commercial sector, followed by academia, government, nonprofit, and hospital. So just another thing to keep in mind as we go through these findings. This data set is all the exit briefing remarks made from fall 2011 to December 2013. 4,815 findings, 671 site visits. So it's a lot of comments we sifted through. And we sort of analyze these every few years to see where institutions may have common challenges in managing their animal program. To give you an idea of the big picture here before we drill down on training and competency, we look at programs in terms of 6 basic program components: animal environment, occupational health and safety, the IACUC or ethics committee, veterinary care program, the physical plant of the animal facilities themselves, and a category we call institutional administration. Those are the things program-wide that institutions need to accomplish in order to conduct a scientific enterprise with animals. That institutional administration component is this sort of amber block here. 10% of all those 4,815 findings fall into that category. That's where we place training. So we'll be talking about that piece of the pie for the next few slides here. If we look at this category of institutional administration, what occurs there? Number one most cited category within institutional administration is documentation and record keeping. Probably not a big surprise. We have to keep a lot of documents and records in the animal care program. That can be challenging. The guide, for example, says that all training records should be maintained and documented. The number 2 category there is our topic of interest today, training. So we find this issue not uncommonly when we do site visits. We find concerns relative to training. In fact, some of the documentation issues are documentation gaps with the training program. So if we combine those two things, training may very well become the most often cited category in this institutional administration portion of the program. And the other components you can sort of see here, the ALAC program description, concerns with that, issues with disaster plan, authority and responsibility of key personnel like the attending veterinarian, institutional official, IACUC, and then this other category. So if we look at training a little bit more closely, what do we see? The most common category cited on these ALAC site visits are issues regarding personnel training and occupational health and safety. How well they are trained or not with regard to their risks of animal exposure. Following that is a category we call technical qualifications. These are all the things people need to know to either care for animals or conduct procedures at the benchtop involving animals. And that's the number 2 category we see with regard to training. The third one here you can see is the IACUC or oversight body. That's training members of the IACUC to do their job well. The IACUC is such a central role in animal program management. How well do institutions train their members to fulfill their responsibilities? And the third and smallest category you see on the screen is when institutions have training deficits in more than one of these other 3 categories. So, training is something we see as an issue quite regularly. It's not the largest portion of the program in terms of challenges that we see, but it's of interest, I think, to note that 21% of all training deficiencies we see are mandatory deficiencies. That means they're of sufficient concern that ALAC requires the institution to address that issue in order to maintain its accreditation. And of course, the remaining training issues are what we call SFIs, or suggestions for improvement. So they're less concerning, but still think they'd be valuable for your institution to address. In terms of incidents, 18% of site visits, or 18 out of 100, or 1 in 6 site visits, we are finding an issue with regard to training. So not uncommon at all. So that's that big data set, how often we identify training, and the challenges that institutions tend to have with regard to technical training and occupational health training and IACUC member training. So I'll shift to the third segment of my presentation that gets to how can you assess the training program in your institution? How does it work? What are some of the strategies you might employ? This can be quite challenging, and I'll go over some of that at the very end, the challenges we think institutions have with regard to assessing their training program. So I'll offer 4 general ways to get your finger on the pulse as to how well your training program might be working. And this first one goes back to this notion articulated well in the European Directive, that is of competency. Not just are people trained, have we given them a training module, they passed a post-assessment test, and now they're good to go. There may actually need to be a robust competency test or assessment in place to really tell whether or not people assimilate and can practice what was offered in the training program. So does the competency test really discern between a person who may understand the training and someone who doesn't? This is not an easy thing to do. Developing a competency testing program and who needs to be involved, how often that needs to occur, and can it discern between those who are good at a particular job versus those that need some additional training. That's no small undertaking. But our goal is to have people that are well trained, and so a competency testing method of some sort is one way to sort of assure yourself as an institution that you're accomplishing what you intend with your training program. So there's many ways to do that, and way too many and too much detail for us to cover in a short presentation today, but we all understand that competency testing can be of great value, particularly if the test is detailed and comprehensive. Another method I'm just simply calling the ALAC method. And for those of you that host ALAC site visits once every 3 years, you'll recognize this very well. This is a technique that site visit teams use when they assess an institution. to get a feel for how effective the training program is and how well implemented the methods and the expectations of the institutional program are put in place. So quite simply, we walk around and visit animal use areas, those places where animals get used, procedure areas and investigator laboratories, surgery areas, necropsy areas, those critical points where animal use tends to occur. We have very detailed observations and we interview folks. We're basically information gathering, and we do this by asking very general open-ended questions. You tend to ask what people do and they will often tell you. And you have to ask in a detailed way so that you get the information you need to determine whether or not the person you're talking to is competent to do the things they're supposed to do with animals. We look for trends. If we're talking to a person in a lab and there are some gaps in their knowledge or understanding, that may be an issue with one person. But if we talk with, let's say we visit 10 labs and 4 of 10 labs have an issue, let's say with aseptic technique in rodent surgery, then the trend seems to be emerging there that maybe the training program with aseptic surgery may not be sufficiently robust because we're seeing 4 out of 10 people interviewed about aseptic technique not measuring up. So we walk around and we talk to people. It's not very fancy, but it's pretty effective. We compare the answers that people give with the animal care and use protocols, if there's any standard operating procedures or guidelines, institutional expectations, policies of the program. We compare answers we get in the lab or in the procedure area with what the institution expectations are. And if trends emerge, then ALAC will say, we may have an issue here with your training program that might need to be tightened up. Some example questions, since these are sort of open-ended and generic questions, but you'd be surprised how much information you can elicit when you just talk to folks and ask very basic questions. So again, if you've experienced an ALAC site visit, these will look very familiar to you. I'll go through these quickly. I think their value is self-evident. But we'll start out with very general questions and get people to talking to find out what they know and how well trained they were. Something very basic to initially, like describe the animal procedures you conduct in the lab. They'll tell you. And sometimes you're surprised at what the answers are when you ask an open-ended question like that. Are animal procedures performed in the lab described in the protocol? It gets to whether or not they know what's in the protocol and whether or not what they're doing is an approved procedure. Has everyone in the lab read the protocols? Usually, folks we talk to don't know that. The principal investigator might, because they might have a rule in the lab, a good one, that everybody be familiar with the protocols, or at least the protocols on which they are listed as personnel conducting procedures. Here's a good one. What kinds of training did you receive regarding the animal procedures you're conducting? Ask them how they were trained. Was it 10 years ago? Has there been any retraining? Ask them detailed questions once you start this line of questioning. And then ask them if there's any documentation. If not, that's likely an issue. The guide sets down pretty clear expectations that training documents be maintained. So you want to see those as evidence that ongoing training, relevant training is occurring either in the lab or at the IACUC or wherever. And then finally, some specific animal care and use issues with this. These initial questions might be, what are the study endpoints? What are the humane endpoints? These are details in the protocol that get at animal care and use issues relative to animal welfare and well-being. Common questions we ask on site visits. I would offer that these are good questions to maybe involve in your semi-annual evaluations, or if you do post-approval monitoring visits, to incorporate these into your post-approval monitoring. Questions about surgery might include something like, describe the surgery you do, and more specifically, the sterile technique. How do you prepare the animal, the surgeon, the instruments? Where do you do it? Combining what you observe with the answers you get will give you a pretty clear idea if someone understands the tenets of aseptic surgical technique and whether that's being conducted properly. I will tell you that this is a common deficiency that we see. If you look at the institutional expectations, they offer training on surgery. Oftentimes there's a test that folks have to pass in order to conduct surgery. Yet when ALAC comes to town, and ask these questions about surgery, there are often common gaps that emerge about how the technique is actually conducted. So that gets back to that competency. So this is a common area that we see issues with regard to aseptic surgery, particularly in rodents. How do you monitor the animals? Who does that? What is your training? What do you look for? Again, it goes to technical expertise to conduct a surgical procedure. What anesthetic agents do you use? How do you maintain gas anesthetic machines if those are used? How is the gas scavenged? Personnel protection again. High pressure tanks. Dosage calculations for injectables, for example. Depending on the kind of anesthesia you use, you'd have many secondary questions to get at a person's competence and expertise. Here's another big one. We often see gaps in how analgesics are administered. The protocol says one thing, the practice involves another. So when you ask these questions in the lab, you often get very illuminating answers. So what analgesics do you use? What's the schedule of administration? And do you document that? And finally, we're towards the end here, are surgery records kept and available for review? What kind of detail is in those surgical records? And the detail required may vary. If it's a very simple procedure, maybe not much detail is required. If, on the other hand, it's a thoracotomy involving a procedure on a heart, say, that's much more involved, and we would expect more detail with regard to surgical records. Also goes to elucidate the training with regard to the necessity for surgical record keeping. And another big one that we often see issues with are controlled substances and logs of usage, and using them according to whatever regulation and guideline is in play in the country we're in. So we'll ask about that too. Some general questions about veterinary care. How do you get animals to the lab? Do they go through common corridors? Are the cages covered? Are there occupational health issues, in other words, with getting animals from point A to point B? Gets at whether people understand those issues and how they address them. Ask how long animals stay in the lab, because it's important for Animal Care and Use Committee and proper husbandry and care for the animals. Here's one that we always ask, and it's sometimes surprising the answers we get. What do you know if you notice a sick animal or injured animal? The answer we're really looking for is we contact the veterinary staff. But many times it's not the answer we get. In other words, how well trained are folks to recognize injury or sickness, and what training did they receive on how to address that in animals? These really go to core principles of animal welfare. Describe how you euthanize animals and how they were trained to euthanize animals. What exactly do you do? And have them walk you through these various procedures step by step in great detail. You can learn a lot about what somebody knows just by asking these questions. And then finally, related to veterinary care, what do you do with carcass disposal? Sometimes there are hazardous waste issues involved with these kinds of animal use procedures, so you want to know if people understand hazardous containment. Occupational health and safety questions. I think this is the last category I have. Again, these are just example questions, but they can really get at how effective folks are trained. As I mentioned, occupational health and safety training deficits are one of the most common we see. And so we'll often ask about that when we're in these animal use areas. Is everyone in the lab enrolled in the occupational health program? That's the proverbial deer in the headlights look, because some folks don't know what the occupational health program is. It's very telling. So again, if that's one person in a lab somewhere who doesn't know about the occupational health program, that's probably a one-person lab issue. You can address that as a focal issue. Yet, if we ask that of 10, 15, 20 people, and nobody knows, or only a subset of folks know what the occupational health and safety program is, we're starting to believe that maybe there's a trend and an issue emerging about training. We ask about animal allergy. Big problem with laboratory animal users, and so we want to know what you know about laboratory animal allergy. What do you do if you think you have an allergy? Again, training with regard to occupational health and safety and someone's knowledge about how to get ailments associated with their animal use addressed. What risks do you have by virtue of your animal contact, and how were you trained about that, and what are they? And finally, what occupational health training have you received? These are tough questions for folks to answer, but they will really give you a fair idea as to whether these broad areas of the program have been addressed in the training program. Ideally, you would want everybody you come into contact with to be able to answer these questions in great detail. So, number one was competency testing. A good, valuable way to do it, but making that reliable and relevant is challenging. The ALAC method, walking around asking a bunch of questions and comparing those with institutional expectations. The third strategy I have here for assessing training effectiveness is what I'm calling error rate analysis. This can be quite helpful. That is being intentional about monitoring mishaps or errors and the incidence of those, where they occur and how they occur, and analyzing why they occur. You have to do this intentionally. Perfect example is that one institution I visited recently monitored the procedures with regard to euthanasia, and particularly CO2 euthanasia, and how often that was complete or incomplete, making sure that the procedure humanely and completely euthanized the animals, and how often they had problems with that. When they looked for that information and started asking the questions, they found that really their incidence was much higher than they knew about. They were uncomfortable with that, and it clearly pointed to the fact that people needed more training with regard to humane technique in euthanasia. Really important with animal welfare. And it wasn't until that institution started to ask questions about how often do we have mistakes were they able to tell that the training program had a gap. So that's what I mean by error rate analysis. You've got to be intentional. So getting accurate reporting and analysis of those mishaps, determining whether there are emerging trends. It could be reports to the Animal Care and Use Committee. If the veterinarian's reporting that, say, dogs are experiencing interdigital cysts in their feet, there may be an issue with training with regard to how the dog pens and runs are cleaned. And so it may be worthwhile to go look at that procedure and the training of people who conduct that procedure. Just examples of how incidence reporting can give you a heads up on whether or not the training program works. And of course, technical training for the vet and their staffs and the PIs as well. Are there issues, say, with endemic disease in the rodent colonies? If there are, is the health monitoring program sufficient? Do the veterinarians have a robust program implemented? If not, why not? Is there insufficient knowledge on the part of the veterinary staff, or what is the issue? So even monitoring things like incidence of outbreaks and endemic disease in rodent colonies might give you an idea about training for veterinary staff. Number 4 on the slide here I've got as a sort of my final suggestion for monitoring training effectiveness, and that's simply by auditing critical activities. If you have folks conducting tricky procedures, invasive surgeries or other surgeries or procedures that might involve, say, restraint for long periods of time, those are procedures you might just literally want to go watch and make sure that folks who do them are adept in those procedures and doing them according to expectations. So there are critical areas throughout any animal care program, things like biocontainment, where there's human safety issues involved, barriers where there's animal safety involved and integrity of the science involved. So you know what those critical areas of your program are. It's a good idea to have folks who know how those procedures should be conducted to audit those areas, make sure things are happening the way you expect them to. So it's not very fancy, but 4 methods to sort of get a good handle on your overall programmatic training program. So I'm wrapping up here. We're getting near the end. This is not this training program, competency assessment, effectiveness, assessing how this all works is fraught with challenges. I mentioned the glib term one and done. You offer a training module on a particular topic, somebody takes it, and everybody's good to go. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. These are usually ongoing, as that Brussels document listed. How do people maintain their skills, and how do you ensure that they do that? So this is an ongoing process. meaning that there's a tremendous workload burden. Somebody has to monitor this. Somebody has to do the training. Somebody has to be intentional in error rate analysis. Somebody has to walk around and assess how well people are doing at what they do. So making sure your training program is focused, I've got the comment here on the slide, be lean and efficient. That means don't ask people to do training they don't really need. Tailor these training programs, which takes time and effort. Be intentional about that, and don't ask folks to do more training than is really required. I've got, remember the goal on the slide here. The goal is not to have a training program, I don't think. The goal is to have people competent and adept in the procedures that they perform involving animals and the care that they provide to animals. We want people to be good at that. Obviously, training is involved, but we want people to be good. So measure their ability to be competent rather than focus on the training itself. Gives you a slightly different perspective of the issue. Another challenge. In no program that I've ever visited were the people who needed trained a static population of people. It's often a very dynamic population of people, particularly with students who might have animal contact. New people coming into the program all the time. This creates a real challenge to keep them trained and up to speed. Also, contemporary science today and scientific enterprise is international, it's global, multicultural, different languages. People bring their own biases and understanding with them into the lab, and the training program needs to address all that. It's a pretty tall order. So just a language barrier, let alone a cultural barrier, can be quite a challenge to make sure that the objectives of training are met and implemented. And finally, a word about trainers. Back years ago, I had a veterinary technician who was wonderful at venipuncture. She could hit any vein or vessel that you needed, and she could collect blood. And so who better than this young lady to teach others how to do proper blood collection techniques in animals? Well, it didn't work. Just because she was adept at the procedure didn't mean that she was a good trainer. In fact, she had a knack for it. It was so easy for her, she became frustrated when others couldn't understand how to do it. So she was not the best trainer, even though she was perfectly adept and knowledgeable herself. So making sure that trainers are effective at imparting the appropriate information is another pretty tall order. I'll leave you with one final thought in closing, and this is something we see time and again at ALAC site visits. When we see issues with regard to training, it's usually because we've had an issue with 2 or 3 crucial aspects of animal care program management. One is animal well-being. Deficits in training often impact negatively animal well-being, and maybe human safety, and maybe scientific integrity. So it's a lot of people consider this sort of a necessary evil to have a training program, but it really is at the core of good science and good animal care, and we see this all the time on site visits. With that, I'll close my remarks, and I think we can probably go to Q&A, so I'll turn it back to Bob Woodard.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bradfield, for that informative presentation. Before we get started on the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone how to submit their questions. You can submit questions by typing them into the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. And we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Let's look at our first question here. This is a question from Laura, and the question is it possible to know how many labs in Colombia have ALAC accreditation? If there are any, can you tell me which ones? So let me turn that over to John for the answer.
Accredited programs in Colombia. I don't believe so, but this is an answer that will change literally 3 times a year. Every time we have a council meeting to confer accreditation on new applications, will often add new countries. I think as we currently stand, we do not have an accredited institution in Colombia. To be sure, you can visit the ALAC website, alac.org, and there is a listing of accredited institutions on our website. Be aware, though, that not all institutions are listed there. They can choose to withhold their name if they want to. Most institutions are listed, but not all. So you can go and verify that I think I'm giving you the right information, that no institutions in Colombia as of right now. But we do see a lot of interest and activity in Latin America. And I think we will probably see more countries in that region of the globe joining ALAC in the coming year, or a couple of years at least.
Okay, we have next question is from Paulina. She would like to know, during one of your visits and after you've identified deficiencies in regards to training, how do you sort them out?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's a great question, and it really can be a challenge. When does, perhaps asked another way, your question might be, when does an issue that we have concern about become an issue about, say, aseptic surgery versus an issue with training? And there's no hard and fast rule about when we start to globalize the issue across the program, other than sort of an incidence. I mentioned it in the presentation. So if it's one or two labs out of a good number that we visit that have a particular issue, say aseptic surgery, then we tend to think, well, this is not a training issue. This is probably an issue specifically with that lab and how they conduct surgery. So it might be a finding, but we wouldn't capture it as a training finding. On the other hand, at some point, the site visit team will start to say, you know, we're beginning to see a theme emerge here with regard to a number of people that seem to be vague or unclear or poorly trained on a procedure or an aspect of the program, whether it be a husbandry procedure or an experimental procedure or surgery or what have you. If we start to see that occur with some incidents throughout the site visit, then we say, aha, this may be a broader issue than just the odd lab here or two. It may indeed be a training issue. So it's not a very good answer to your question, but at some point, because of the incidents and perhaps the severity, it'll occur to us that it's really larger than just one part of the program, and it encompasses many areas of the program, therefore a training issue. Hope that helps.
Well, Dr. Bradfield, the next question isn't exactly a question, but it's it's from Russell, and he says, "Thank you, John, for a great talk. Several key points for everyone to take home and present to their groups." So let's see if you have any comments on that.
Well, I appreciate the feedback. I find this a challenging topic to discuss. That notwithstanding, I think it's a very important topic. I mentioned at the end that issues with training often involve issues with animal well-being and welfare, scientific integrity, or human safety. I mean, what can be more important than that? So it's a tall order to talk about and capsulize in a short program. The devil is in the details. I appreciate your comments. This is a challenge for every program that I've ever been involved with, either as a site visitor or as a veterinarian. And I think having sort of a general discussion and format in which we can discuss what works, what the challenges are, and what doesn't is always a good thing. So I appreciate your remarks.
One last question from Marcel. Its question is, what are the reasons some institutions choose not to publish their name as accredited in the ALAC website? And for the answer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we can all probably guess, but the motives might be different for each institution. And granted, this is a minority of institutions. I think the institutional culture of some places is to say fly below the radar. They don't necessarily want to advertise the fact that they conduct research that involves animals. Some of that's probably the result of experience, negative experience with extremists or attacks from extremists, so they have concerns about that. That's probably the most obvious reason. But there could be others, and I'm speculating here. Again, this doesn't happen frequently. Most people are very proud of their ALAC accreditation, and they're happy to demonstrate that they're part of the ALAC family, if you will. But we honor an institution's request for confidentiality, and so we will do that and not publish their name if they don't want it.
This question is from Chris. The question is, in your experience with site visits, what has been a common response from institutions in regards to findings of deficiencies in their training programs?
Yeah, it's a good question. The specific answer of how they tend to address those issues probably depends on the area in which the gaps occur. If it's an issue with IACUC member training, the common response is to allocate resources to send IACUC members outside the institution for some kind of formal training. Institutions can get very provincial in their level of understanding, and so to help avoid that business as usual kind of mentality, they'll send IACUC members outside for additional training. We see that a lot. We think that's an effective strategy. If it involves occupational health and safety training, frankly, this is a big challenge because identifying people who are at risk and what their particular risks are according to their job exposures, as well as their personal health histories, that involves really ramping up the robustness of the occupational health program. And that's a tall order. Institutions are challenged to do that. But we will often see, for example, with occupational health and safety training issues, specific resources allocated. Well, we'll get another occupational health and safety physician or nurse or a health and safety professional who's responsible for training, or we'll integrate the veterinarian in safety training, perhaps. So that the specific correction of the issue depends on the specific gap that there is in training. But generally it involves allocating people, time and effort, and resources, and that might be new positions at the institution or repurposing some existing positions. That's typically what we see.
Well, if there are no further questions from our audience, I guess it's time to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone in the audience for their questions and for participation in today's event. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through August 2015. You will receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to any of your colleagues who may have missed this event. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you and goodbye.